And if you back up and do a whole lot of summarizing, you're losing the impetus of getting to yourself. I mean, that's where you're going. That's how this all fits together. You are now joining the conversation that you have traced. Now, there are several ways of actually getting in, concluding this to get into your methodology. And sometimes they end up being separate sections. Sometimes they end up being separate chapters in the thesis or a dissertation. But they're usually things like whatever your hypotheses are, whatever your research topics are, the research areas you're going to cover. Sometimes you phrase them as research questions. That is my least, the one I would suggest that you use the least, because, as I've been telling Dinah here, the problem with research questions is they lend themselves to one-word answers. Is it viable to do X? No. So I'm going to quit reading. Or yes, right? I mean, it doesn't give you any exploration. Where if you say, it gives you no room to like investigate or to explore. So if you can phrase it more as a topic that you're talking about, like instead of that saying the effectiveness of using something or other, then you've got, we're going to explore the effectiveness of it. That gives you room to do some exploration and some investigation, and it suggests that kind of development rather than a one-word answer, a yes or a no, or a one little sentence answer in my head. Does that make sense? As a general rule, you don't want to pose questions, right? You want to provide the answers for me. And if you ask a question, and again, this is kind of sometimes a research paper technique you have taught to keep your reader engaged by asking a question. But you're beyond like undergraduate research paper kind of writing. You're moving into the professional arena. And the issue with questions is if your reader doesn't answer it the way you want them to, you're in a lot of trouble. Because you want to be guiding me all along as you write this so that I'm seeing and understanding this exactly the way that you did. Which is why when you do your literature review, you're tying everything together. You're explaining your thought process so that I'm following you along every step of the way. Now, the thing about introductions is it's the first thing that the reader reads, correct? This is my introduction to you as the person that we're having this relationship at the time. If you write a good introduction and it's all well tied together, and especially if you start it really, really well, if you kind of get a little messy in here some of the time, I'm going to blame myself. I'm going to say, this person writes so well, I followed everything that they're saying. Just because I don't quite understand this, or I don't quite understand this, or I got a little lost in one of the little parts about the literature review, I'm going to say, I just wasn't reading carefully enough. That's what the problem was. You can cover up a multitude of sins if you begin and you start your introduction well, because the reader has already formed an impression of you. If you start your introduction and I'm confused, I'm struggling to try to understand what you're doing and what you're saying, then I have created that, you've created that impression in me. And I'm going to give up in frustration, or I'm going to go into this part of it and I'm going to create issues, right? Because I'm already thinking about issues and problems. Does that make sense? The better you start this off, the more I'm with you, the more likely that I'm not even going to notice if you have problems. And if I do notice, I'm going to say, I need to go back because it's my fault this happened rather than yours. So that's part of the reason why it's worth it to really struggle through an introduction. All right, discussion. Another problem area. And technically, probably for you all, in the beginning, it's going to be the hardest. Because this discussion does exactly what every single piece of literature has already done for you. Now all of a sudden you've got all this data. All of this previously unknown data that somehow you're going to have to figure out what it means. And that's hard. What do you do with this raw data? And you've got to work through understanding what it is, how best to analyze it, how best to present it to an audience. That is very difficult to do. Usually by the time you get that straightened out, I mean, because you're a professional, and so once you figure out what it is you need to do with it, it's probably not as difficult to write as this is, because again, you're intimately involved with it. But in the beginning, to all of a sudden have all this raw data can be a little bit overwhelming. And it takes a while to think through it. It's not something that's going to happen, like overnight, because you've actually got to study it and analyze it, and I'm sure you all know, because you have probably done this many times. But it takes a while to kind of start piecing all of this together and having it clearly explained. And then, once you've done that, then you get to the conclusion of this. And like I said, remember, you're aiming for moving me forward. So it's probably not a matter of summarizing. This is what the purpose of this research was. This is what we did. This is how we did it. This is what we found. You've already told me that. And if you've tied all of this together, I haven't forgotten. Because everything builds on the next section. So, when you're doing your results and your discussion, you're already kind of letting me know if this supports other people's results. If it doesn't support other people's results, right? So you're keeping all of this kind of in the forefront of my mind. So I'm kind of aware of the conversation, of what you've done, and how it's all fitting together. So this moves it even farther forward. What are the implications and the significance of this research? And you start with, what is it to the conversation that's going on? How do you fit into what you said up here, right, that you said you were going to do? How do you fit in? How do you join in and now move this research forward? How does it fit in then with the field that you are in? You take it out another step. How does it then fit in the broader context of your field? And if you can get out and save all of mankind by the time you get to your conclusion, right? I mean, you've actually taken your research and explained what the significance and the implications are. Remember, we're all self-absorbed and egotistical, right? We're all Christopher Robins up here. So what I'm interested in is, how is this research going to affect me? How are you going to make my life better, right? So you have something to add to this research conversation, which is in a very small professional audience. You've got something to add to the field, right? That's a slightly broader audience. Well, if you can get out to, not only does this have implications for electronics in this small little minor microchip in this little tiny piece of equipment, but it also has further implications in giving me a better microwave, right? Now you've got me, right? Think of all the things that the space program has given us. I mean, Tang, right? I mean, who could live without Tang? But I mean, isn't that one of the things that the space program has discovered? You all are so young. You haven't been around since dinosaurs roamed the earth. But this does have something to do with like research and funding, because research is only going to be as active as funding. Well, some funding, quite a lot of it, comes from taxpayers, right? I mean, some of it comes from private foundations, Bill Gates, but some of it comes with like federal agencies, NSF, right? That's taxpayer money. How do you get that kind of, the audience, right, a more public audience, involved in thinking this should be something that we should support? Well, the space race was one thing back when it was the Cold War and it was Russia versus United States, and then we had to really show that we were going to be the super space power when we lost the beginning, right? Because they sent the first space flight up. Well, so what they did with a lot of their research is they then put it into the private sector. So we get Tang, got a lot of computer information, calculators, helped led to development of calculators, we got microwaves. So it was a way of saying this research not only has implications for space scientific knowledge, it has implications in the political arena, right? And it also has implications for just the everyday person. So look at how they've got the implications extended. gives you more funding, right? Now they even send back all those beautiful pictures. Right? Persuasion, right? Take a look at, don't you want to see what the farthest reaches of the galaxy looks like? Take a look at these lovely pictures. And isn't that all in part to keep us engaged and interested? So yeah, so I mean, the farther out that you can give your implications, you know, the broader impact it's going to have, right? And the more worthwhile it's going to seem. And then you conclude with, well, this was only one little study, right? This is just the first step. Future work would include doing these kinds of things, right? So now you're looking to the future. You started in the past, got to the present, and now you're to the future. Does that kind of make sense? Or have you kind of noticed that structure in your 8 hours worth of reading, right? It's all very chronological and all fits together very well. You're telling a story. So, 2 questions to keep in mind while you're telling this. And your writing has got to actually answer these questions. Not that your writing is going to answer it mechanically, a little engineering humor here, or very overtly, but you're very subtly making sure this is clear. And these are the 2 questions. Why am I telling my reader this? It has got to be clear to your audience why you're telling me this. And why am I telling my reader this here? How does it relate to what I just said? And how does it relate to where I'm going? And if you can keep that all straight, and like I said, you're not going to say, I'm telling you this here because you need to know it, or because of blah, blah, blah. It is all very subtle. You're doing it with the way you structure this, you're doing this with your language, you're doing this with the transitions that you use, you're doing it with the focus and the emphasis that you're giving it, but it should be very clear to your audience why you're telling me this and why I'm learning it here. And if you can do that, then what happens is you get rid of all those little nitpicky questions that English teachers put beside writing all the time. What do you mean? There's no coherence here. I need more details. Give me some examples. Why? How? Elaborate. Right? Isn't that what we write all the time? That's what we put there all the time. Is more details, examples. Why? How? And that's because we're having trouble figuring out why you're telling me this and why you're telling me this here. And if you add those details, then you're putting it in that broader context, and it's very helpful. And if you do that, because quite often what you get, a lot of comments sometimes, and like I said, I've been on both sides here of this. I've had papers I've written myself that have gone through this, and I've also taught since dinosaurs roamed the earth. And I can tell you that if you keep it very clear why you're telling me this and why you're telling me this here, all these other little questions that kind of appear because I'm confused or I'm not seeing the relationships, I don't even think of those. I'm focused on your logic and your reasoning, which is what you're laying out for me. And it gets rid of a lot of those questions, because some of the times you want to say, but I don't want to go there, right? I don't want to add that. Isn't that what your answer is? That doesn't have anything to do with what I'm talking about. Well, the reason it came into my head to ask it was you're not making it clear to me why you're telling me something and why it's here. And as soon as all this is laid out like a story and I'm following your logic, it gets rid of all those kinds of questions. Okay, questions or problems about this? You've all kind of noticed this structure, huh? Even if you didn't really notice this structure. All right, a couple of other things. One is the level of your language. And part of the reason why I want to caution you to make sure that you keep your notebooks very, very complete and up to date and very easy to read is to a certain degree because of this. You're not writing a reflection here. When you actually write up this article at the end of your stay here, it's not a reflection. It's not a blog post. It's not a discussion board post. And sometimes what happens when you're writing in your notebooks, you're putting down thinking of it in those kinds of contexts. And I mean, it's not. It's, like I said, a publishable quality article here. And so the language is very academic. It's not going to be reflective or subjective or personal. It's going to be very objective. So you want to eliminate a lot of this informal language. All right, give me some examples of informal language.
Contractions.
Contractions, for the most part, you're going to not write contractions.
Slang.
Such as. I mean, I don't want to read things like a lot, a great deal of, right? All, really, really, very, very. None of that kind of language, because that's very informal, right? I mean, this is very precise. It's very specific. It's very professional sounding rather than being unprofessional kind of casual conversation or reflection or blog post or Facebook post, right?